Alright, so this is video 2 for October 7th. Alright, so October 7th? Yes, that's today. Correct.
Hi, Leah. Oh, can I say hi?
No, don't say hi to anybody.
Hi, Martin.
No!
I'm sorry.
Alright, we're now moving to reform. This is what you really want to get down today because this is what's going to tie into your DBQ, which you need to write starting this, today or tomorrow. And again, for the 4th hour folks, we are moving this to be turned in Friday, not to Thursday. Okay, so reform goes through several stages in this period, but because of the Great Awakening and because of other things that are happening too, the early to mid 1800s is very big on reform. So by 1820s to 1850s is a big time for reform in America. As you already know, there was a DBQ on this a few years ago, so it's a big theme. At first, a lot of people who did reform wanted to improve moral behavior through persuasion. They thought they made various organizations that could help persuade people in society using conviction or using Christianity or whatever to make them change their habits. But over time, they realized that they had better chances at doing like pamphlets and sermons. Move away from pamphlets and sermons to go to like politics. Like basically try to start voting law changes in, legislative morality. That'd be better than pamphlets and sermons in general. So the first one we're going to look at is temperance. The first movement we're going to look at is temperance. Temperance refers to banning alcohol. There was a lot of alcohol consumption in the 1820s and 30s, and they saw it as an easy explanation of why people in society act bad or poorly. So their go-to answer was, well, if you just take it out of society, then they can't act bad, right? So they're tempering people's behavior. So that's where the word temperance comes from. So that's what you want to associate with temperance. Temperance and prohibition go hand in hand. They're trying to prohibit alcohol consumption by everybody, but they're also trying to temper people's use. So that those two words should be going together. There was a very high rate of consumption. On average in 1820, there's about 5 gallons of hard liquor consumed per person. So about 5 gallons of hard liquor consumed per person in 1820.
Like a week or a day or
the whole year.
Oh, that's
That's not that bad.
But I think that's including children. It's everybody. Like that's like per person on average.
Oh.
5 gallons of hard liquor per person in 1820. A lot of this is also because of immigration. We mentioned this kind of before too, that a lot of immigrants have a lot looser standards when it comes to alcohol consumption. So they drank a lot more. They still drink a lot more than we do in terms of when they allow it, at what age and how they drink and so forth and so on. So they blame a lot of this on their influence as well. But they thought this was causing a lot of society's problems. And it became a very popular reform movement. A lot of preachers, a lot of Protestant preachers as well as women were heavily involved in the temperance movements. A lot of Protestant preachers and women were heavily involved in this movement, as many reform movements in general. The first organization formed to deal with this was the American Temperance Society in 1826. It was formed by Protestant ministers and others concerned for the effects of drinking. So the American Temperance Society was founded by Protestant ministers and others concerned with the effects of drinking. Their goal was to have people take a pledge of total abstinence. They wanted people to take a pledge of total abstinence, meaning what? You don't drink at all, right? Why? And that's a very Protestant thing to do. If you're tempted by the sin, just don't do it, right? Drinking itself is not really necessarily a sin, but because you might lead a sinful behavior, just don't do it at all, right? There you go. The other group that forms are the Washingtonians. The Washingtonians formed in 1840. So the Washingtonians formed in 1840. This is a group formed by recovering alcoholics. So the Washingtonians is a group formed by recovering alcoholics who are the first to reference alcoholism as a disease needing treatment. So Washingtonians are one of the first groups to refer to alcoholism as a disease needing treatment. I don't really know the answer to that question. I don't know if there's a tie in George Washington or if it's a tie in Washington, D.C. I have to look it up and see, but I don't really know why they chose that name. It's not like I don't think George Washington was like a non-drinker, so
Maybe he was an alcoholic.
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think so.
We don't.
I don't think he was alcoholic. Maybe he drank a lot. I don't think he was an alcoholic. Over 1 million joined in these temperance organizations by the 40s. So over 1 million people joined these temperance organizations by the 40s. The middle class heavily embraced this. So the middle class heavily embraced temperance in general. Many immigrants opposed the temperance push, obviously. But by the 50s, you do see a lot of factories and politicians join together and support temperance. So by the 1850s, there are a lot of politicians and factory owners who are supporting temperance in general because it helped reduce crime and poverty. It helped to reduce crime and poverty, and it also helped increase work output too. So by the 1850s, factory owners and politicians joined together for temperance because it reduced crime and poverty and increased work output. And they're actually able to get states to create prohibition before the Civil War. There are 12 states, Maine being the first one, that creates prohibition pre-Civil War. And that's one thing about prohibition. We're not going to get to the national prohibition until the 19-teens, but it's not like it was a light switch. It's not like one day the country had it, next day we didn't. It had been gradually developing over several decades to where by the 19-teens, the majority of states had already passed prohibition laws. It was already becoming a national occurrence. So, but it starts here. It starts here pre-Civil War where people are pushing for the banning of alcohol overall in general. But like many other reform movements, it gets overshadowed by what issue in the 50s? Slavery and the coming Civil War. And so you don't see prohibition, temperance kind of take back over as a big national movement until the 70s and 80s. So that's temperance. The next one is public asylums. There was a lot of people that society didn't understand. They just got locked away in common jails. So criminals, emotionally disturbed people, and paupers, people who are in poverty, were just getting locked away in prisons. Or not even prisons, but jails. So you had mentally handicapped people, mentally disturbed people who were just locked away in a jail to basically rot there because people didn't want to deal with them. Or people who were poor on the streets, whatever the case is. They lived in terrible conditions. They were also neglected, caged up. So reformers become aware of these problems and want to try to create new public institutions or public asylums that would deal with this behavior, would deal with these kind of people and try to treat them, reform them, right? So there's an effort to build up prisons, mental hospitals, and poorhouses. There's an effort to create prisons, mental hospitals, and poorhouses that would help cure a lot of their antisocial behavior and help reform them. The number one name, and really the only name you need to know in this whole category, is Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix, who's this lady right here, was a big-time supporter of public asylums. So Dorothea Dix is a big-time supporter of public asylums. She personally went and toured some of these facilities and found mentally handicapped people locked up in jail like they were common criminals and treated very poorly. They got no medical attention, no doctor treatment, nothing like that, no evaluations. So she dedicates her life to trying to get aid to help the mentally disabled and travel state to state to get funding for public asylums. She does this first in Massachusetts. And then she begins to go to the places. So she begins to get state land and state facilities developed in Massachusetts, and then goes to other places to get more places to provide public funding for public asylums. But that's kind of her focus, was mental institutions. Back then they were called sanatoriums. So you have some older buildings called sanatoriums way back then. You also get schools for the blind and deaf developed. We have one here in Baton Rouge. But now you have schools that cater to these people who have these disabilities, people who are blind and deaf. many states begin to have these by the 1850s. Then you have prisons. So instead of locking a criminal up in jail, they begin to say, like, they begin to think that all people are, naturally good, right? Prison can be a way to do what? Reform them, right? They got bad because of their nature, or become not nature, because of their nurture, how they were brought up. So if we put them in a reform system in prison, that can hopefully become part of society one day again. So penitentiaries began to replace jails, and they experimented with different techniques to try to get these guys to repent and reflect on their sins. A lot of social training, a lot of education, trying to give them job skills to make them more marketable when they come out of prison, and teach them how to behave in proper society overall. Everybody's good on public asylums? Yes? Great. All right. Public education. So, again, this is mostly coming from New England early on. A lot of middle-class people were motivated by the fear of future generations not having educated people, like whether it be from poor people or immigrants. You have a lot of Americans growing up who would have no education, essentially, or have very little. And so there's a call to start having schools funded by what? The government through what? Taxes, right? So there's a lot of calls in the 1830s and 40s to have tax-supported school systems developed. Horace Mann, man spelled M-A-N-N. Horace Mann was one of the first people to suggest this. He's kind of like the father of public education in America. But he wanted to have free compulsory schools. What does compulsory mean? You have to go, right? Which is what you're on an obligation right now. So back then it was like maybe 1st through 5th or 6th grade. It wasn't very long. You had to go to school, mandatory, but they wanted you to have some basic education with reading and writing, math, and those kind of things. So they wanted everybody to have some basic compulsory school early on, but for free. That anybody could go, immigrants or poor people or whoever could go. Their schools would also be a place to do moral education as well, too. So schools would also be a place to do moral education as well. Teach them how to do hard work, how to be punctual, how to be sober. That's one of the things we got to teach all today in school. Hey, man, there's no laws back then about age. Right. Now it's all y'all vaping. Stop vaping in the bathrooms and stuff, right? It's gonna blow up in your mouth.
I don't understand why we had dare in 5th grade and we don't have it now. It's not necessary.
Because they gave you your shot, you had your chance, and what did you do with that chance? Yeah, exactly. And it's gonna blow up in your face. Just keep vaping away. Puff, puff. Explosion. Right.
She's gonna bring the contract that we signed.
Look at this. Look at this. Little 4th grade Ashley signed this. What was she think about your behavior? Your baby. All right. So the Second Great Awakening was also helpful in fueling private colleges more too. We're not really to the point yet of a lot of public institutions. That doesn't really happen until Civil War and later. But you do see more private colleges being developed. Like you have some in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. A lot of Protestant colleges being developed. You also have women's colleges opening because the men's colleges won't let them attend. Mount Holyoke and Oberlin College. So Mount Holyoke and Oberlin College were two examples of women's colleges opening in the mid-1800s to admit women for education. You said it, I did. Let the record show they said it, not me. Yeah. Just trust your husbands more,
You
right?
don't need a degree to cook.
All right. Changing American Family and Women's Rights. So, Changing American Family and Women's Rights. Most Americans were still very rural by the 30s, 40s, 50s, but profound changes were happening within the family in industrial cities. So the families that were living in cities were going through a lot of gender change and a lot of role changes that are happening in general. Not that kind of gender change.
Not yet.
Men left the home to work for salaries or wages 5 or 6 days a week. And that was their primary role, was to be the wage earner, the breadwinners for the family, to go out and work. So if you were a middle class or an upper class woman who was married, your role was to be the house. So that becomes very normal for the middle and upper classes to have the man go out and work, make a wage or make a salary 6 days a week, and then the wife would stay home, take care of the house, take care of the kids. Fewer children were being, we mentioned this before, fewer children were being had because you don't need as many kids in a city, and that's more mouths to feed. Also, a lot of these middle class and upper class women had a lot of free time because that's all they're doing in general, which is why these are the ones who a lot of times were involved in reform movements. They got a lot of time, so they're the ones out there protesting for temperance or protesting for public asylums, whatever the case is, because they don't got to work. What you have created is a cult of domesticity. This is a term you want to be familiar with. The cult of domesticity forms, and it very much defines gender roles. This really only applies to middle and upper class, though. This really only applies to middle and upper class in general. This really only applies to middle and upper class in general. So the men dealt with the worldly affairs, they dealt with the economy, they dealt with the politics of the world, and all that's a very heavy burden to bear. So the outside world is the man's world, the inside of the house is the woman's world. Her job is to make it a peaceful refuge, to take care of the family, take care of the man. Like the man wants to come home from work and wants to take all those burdens off his shoulders and come into a nice relaxing meal, the kids are being patted off the bed, right? That's her job. That's the cult of domesticity. So it's this idealized version of the woman as the moral leader and educator of the household. So it's this idealized version of the woman being the moral leader and educator for the household. Any comments?
Sounds all right. Yeah.
All right. Right. Women, but there are some women who also are going to fight for rights in this time period. Whoa. One of the main reasons why women began to fight for rights in the 1840s is because in a lot of the reform movements they're being ostracized. Like most famously, there's these abolition meetings that they're not allowed to speak at because they're women, and so basically because they have these other reform protest movements that they can't be fully leaders of, that leads to them breaking off and developing their own movement for equal rights and so forth. So women reformers resented this secondary role in the reform movements, and they couldn't fully participate in policy discussions. So two of your earliest leaders are Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. These two ladies right here, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They campaigned for women's rights after being prevented to speak at an anti-slavery convention. So these are like pre-Susan B. Anthony. Like these women are, Susan B. Anthony's about to be around soon, but these are like pre-Susan B. Anthony. The most famous thing they do is they form a women's rights convention called, or located in Seneca Falls. So Seneca Falls in 1848, they hold the first women's rights convention in America. It's in upstate New York. They basically copy and imitate a lot of the Declaration of Independence and change the wording in a way to basically say, all men and women are created equal. This document's called the Declaration of Sentiments. I think I'll read it this year in English. We all will eventually. So they create this very famous manifesto or document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which basically is kind of reworking the Declaration of Independence and trying to promote women's equality. So they're fighting for equality, but they're also fighting for what right too. Right? Well, reform, but what for women personally? Suffrage, right? They're also fighting for suffrage as well. So they're fighting for equality, but they're also fighting for suffrage. So they want equal voting, legal and property rights. They want equal voting, legal and property rights. Declaration of Sentiments. Declaration of Sentiments. But, like many other things, they're overshadowed by the 50s by what? Slavery and the war. So women's rights will become a bigger deal after the war, leading up to the 1910s. Just a little bit left. Any questions about any of this? Everybody's good? All right. I just got to do a smidge on the other slide, and then we'll be done. That's where Ford never got to. What? Just so the area to focus on today and tomorrow is going to be the anti-slavery movement or the abolition movement that's forming. Abolitionists are people who are anti-slavery, range from moderates who wanted to see some kind of gradual emancipation to radicals who urged immediate emancipation and no compensation to the owners. Because that's the other thing too. If you free slaves, do the owners get compensated for it? Who pays for that? You go from having moderates who were okay with gradual emancipation to radicals who want it now and no compensation for the owners. And so we know that the North had been moving away from slavery by the 1820s, but what makes them see it as a sin now more than ever? What event? Second Great Awakening, right? So in the 1820s, the Second Great Awakening makes the North feel convicted about slavery and makes them want to go out more against it. Before, they were moving away from it, but didn't say about it or try to protest it, but now they are going because of the Second Great Awakening. They see it as a sin. So one thing I want to mention and end on today is the American Colonization Society, and that's going to be it. So there was an early attempt to try to address this in the 1810s and 20s called the American Colonization Society. They were like, if we take free slaves and move them to Africa and let them start their own community there and live there. Well, it's not necessarily them, though. A lot of these guys have been there in America now for generations, right? Yeah, so in 1822, the American Colonization Society establishes a colony in Africa called Monrovia, Liberia. This is where Liberia comes from. It's like, right? So Liberia is formed as a country in Africa with their capital being Monrovia because the president in 1822. And they begin to relocate freed African Americans to Monrovia they want to go. This makes a dent in slavery in general. It is a failed idea. Slavery increases from 1.5 million people in 1820 to 4 million in 1860. So slavery increases from 1.5 million people in 1820 to 4 million by 1860. Only 12,000 went to Monrovia. So a little bit of comedy. So it was somewhat of an answer, but not a realistic one because it didn't really fix the problem at all. But it was an attempt to try to address slavery. This is before things get really heated in America too, in terms of North versus South. Whenever this all gets developed in the 1820s. Yeah, it's where 4 hour got.